Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. And now the Friday Crime Report. Today's crime report is a twofer. Both of these crimes happened on the exact same day but had wildly different outcomes. You'll definitely want to stick around to hear this one to the end. Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, Sunday, January 5th, 2025, 10:50 p.m. Preston Coleman was a father, grandfather, and a U.S. veteran. The 52-year-old Coleman frequented the Aliquippa VFW post. On Sunday night, Mr. Coleman was sitting at the VFW. Around 10:50 p.m., he was approached by a white man named Brett Hours, who ostensibly sat down with him for the sake of having a friendly conversation, just two vets chatting it up. Only a few minutes later, this white man took out a knife and began stabbing the top of the bar and staring menacingly at Mr. Coleman, and suddenly began to attack Mr. Coleman, punching him in the face. Mr. Coleman fell to the ground, and the white assailant continued to beat him. Cameras inside the Penn Avenue post captured the beating, according to police. As they reported it, Mr. Coleman was soaked in blood and tried multiple times to get up while the attacker continued punching and kicking him in the head and face. At one point, Hours tried to get his girlfriend to hand him back the knife. She refused, so he then punched her in the face. For another 20 minutes, this violent thug continued to beat Mr. Coleman, punching and kicking him more than 300 times over the course of this racial attack, occasionally stopping only to take a break before continuing his violent assault. He even went so far as to grab a bar stool to beat his victim with and use the stool to choke Mr. Coleman. At one point, the attacker stood on Mr. Coleman's throat, but Hours wasn't the only attacker. There was another white man, 43-year-old Ronald Brown, who came into the bar in the middle of the assault. He saw the victim battered and completely defenseless and also started beating him too. Brown is the father of the bartender who was there that night. The bartender, a woman, stood by while her daddy attacked Mr. Coleman, and she just turned and walked away. So none of this was happening accidentally. As police reported, Brown clearly observed the severity of the assault and that the victim was completely helpless. Brown also knew at this time nobody dialed 911 and there was no help on the way for the victim. Seeing all of this and knowing all the facts, Brown made the decision to join in on the attack. Investigators said as Hours held the defenseless man on the ground, Brown repeatedly punched him in the head, neck, and face. After that, police said Brown wiped his hands off and continued to watch Hours violently assault the victim. Ronald Brown eventually turned himself in at about 2:00 p.m. on the following day on charges of felony aggravated assault and liability for conduct of another, as well as a misdemeanor charge of simple assault.
The victim beaten so brutally and badly, a helicopter had to land here to get him to level 1 trauma care ASAP. This is the man police are saying is the suspect, 39-year-old Brett Hours. District Attorney Nate Bible says Hours is dangerous. What if someone should happen to see this man?
Sure. Do not approach him. It seems like the damage that was done to the victim in this case.
The relentless punching and kicking goes on for a long time. Blood is splattered on the walls. Hours then begins strangling Preston. The endless attack continues for 30 minutes.
From what they told me, that the victim was almost unrecognizable.
The victim, Preston Coleman, remains in the hospital fighting for his life.
So they're lowballing the charges for what actually was an act of attempted murder that he helped to take part in. But of course, he's got genetic immunity from the law, so taking part in an attempted murder, well, that only carries a measly $100,000 bond, which he easily paid, and he was back on the loose a short time later. And speaking of animals on the loose, an arrest warrant has been issued for Hours, and he's now been charged with attempted first-degree murder, aggravated assault as a felony, strangulation, process instrument of a crime as a felony, and misdemeanor simple assault. Now, this guy has numerous mugshots, so he's no stranger to the police, and while his criminal record isn't being reported on, you can tell by all the white supremacist tattoos he's got that he wasn't in prison for writing bad checks. Notice how these creeps all look alike? Just like the trash who murdered Ahmaud Arbery, they all look like they belong in the movie Deliverance, just a bunch of inbred mountain men, which is probably the case. Like a mad scientist experimented with mixing genes of a Neanderthal with a dog, which would certainly make sense given their behavior. But these race soldiers are not suspended in midair. They're protected and encouraged by their fellow racists. This race attack is a perfect example of how they operate. One or two of these assailants carry out the attack while their cohorts hang back and cover for them, acting as support staff for these race soldiers. And you see how this thug carried out his violent assault. He acted like he was befriending Mr. Coleman at first, just two soldiers hanging out at the bar. But in reality, this race soldier was just trying to get close enough to his victim to stage his ambush. And considering that none of the other white witnesses to this attack did anything, it's clear why he felt so emboldened to do so. He knew the environment that he was in, and they knew it too. When you go to the Aliquippa VFW's Facebook page, they're now announcing that they're closed indefinitely. Yeah, I bet they are. When your establishment is the scene of a racially motivated attempted murder that your employees and their family and friends took part in, I guess it would be a good idea to lay low for a while. Their business license ought to be stripped, their liquor license and everything else they got. These people are basically accessories to an attempted murder. None of the people at that bar, or rather that race clavern, attempted to help Mr. Coleman. No one bothered to call the police on these racist thugs, and these people claim that they love the police so much. You see, these are not veterans of foreign wars. These are active members of a race war. Black people need to be on alert no matter what. Especially black people who work for the government in some capacity, be it as teachers, the county courthouse, or for the police, the fire department, or the military, because a disproportionate number of them seem to often have a blind spot. Not all of them, but a lot. This is not to say that we're blaming Mr. Coleman. He's not to blame for this at all. My point is, there are too many black people who work in some capacity for a government entity who think that these people they work with are more or less not on team white supremacy, or they seem to believe that they have some sort of inside track or some kind of understanding of how these bastions of white power really work. And in too many cases, we've had to have arguments with these people about that kind of thing. A lot of them seem to have the we mentality when talking about the government. And that's deadly, especially talking about these people who are in government. You're not surrounded by coworkers. You're not surrounded by brothers in arms. You're surrounded by a bunch of race soldiers who are simply waiting for their opening to attack. They don't need a reason to attack a black person. As we saw with this violent animalistic assault, all they need is an opportunity. Black people who work in these white supremacist-dominated government entities, they're in the belly of the beast and don't even know it. These white supremacists may have served in the military, but black veterans better understand that as these white supremacists see it, the enemy isn't the Afghans or the Iraqis, the Houthis, or whomever the U.S. military is fighting with this week. The enemy is, and has always been, black people. Now, Taquisha Tucker, Mr. Coleman's eldest daughter, says that she believes the attack on her father was racially motivated, and that's good to hear. Now, this race attack happened on Sunday, an animalistic act of typical white supremacist savagery. The attempted murderer is on the loose. God knows where he is, but he's definitely looking for his next victim. Now, as we all know, when the police really want to find someone, they can. They wanted to find who Jussie Smollett's alleged attackers were, and they found them in record time. A healthcare CEO is gunned down in New York by an anonymous assailant. This guy gets away scot-free, but nonetheless, the white authorities made it international news. And even without having a name, even without knowing anything about the guy, they were able to accurately track his movements throughout the city and had photos of his face posted. This within hours after the kill. But in this case, it's once again color-coded news coverage from the white media. The story is buried. Unless you looked for the story about this attack on Mr. Coleman, the search engine algorithms wouldn't bring it up for you, and these white media outlets won't mention it either. A savage animal attacked a veteran. It was caught on video, and the white media is refusing to publicize it. Well, so much for if it bleeds, it leads. But this incident reminds us all, even if you are a U.S. veteran, if you're black in this country, you better exercise, as the military calls it, situational awareness. The violent attempted murder of Mr. Coleman illustrates the fact that even if you are a U.S. veteran, when it comes to being in America, you're behind enemy lines. And you better understand that fact. And black people need to start acting like it and be prepared to protect themselves. We'll continue with the moment of truth in just a moment, but first, a word from the official sponsor of Black Empowerment, Power Tools. There's no telling when something's going to come up, so make sure you carry your power tools at all times. You never know when you're going to need to bring the hammer down, or when you'll have some trash that needs to be blown away, or some obstacle that requires cutting down. Don't get caught empty-handed. Keep your hammer close by. Keep that leaf blower at the ready, and always carry your steel. Power Tools, because no matter what your day job or side hustle may be, there's no excuse for not being ready to put in some work. And now for our second entry in this week's crime report. This crime took place in Monroe, Louisiana, but on the exact same day as the violent attempted murder of Mr. Coleman, January 5th, 2025. In this incident, you also had another racist white man who called himself attacking a black man, but it didn't go the way he thought. A white man by the name of Clint M. Ferguson started an altercation with a black man in a parking lot of a shoe store. Ferguson drove his vehicle next to the black man's vehicle. Ferguson then got out of his vehicle and shouted, "I hate niggers." This guy was looking for trouble, and he found it. According to the affidavit by the police, the black man Ferguson was menacing got out of his vehicle. Ferguson, rather than leave, continued to yell racial slurs at the black man. The victim of this racial tirade decided to call the police. He was trying to give Ferguson a chance to save himself. Ferguson got back in his vehicle but refused to leave. Instead, Ferguson intentionally drove his car over the victim's foot. This attack had now escalated from mere slurs and threats to outright assault. The victim defended himself, punching Ferguson through his open driver's side window, and Ferguson fled the scene briefly. Police apprehended the racist thug when he came back to the scene of the crime, though the cops had to yank him out of his own vehicle. Ferguson refused to give a statement to the police because white supremacists hate to take an L. He was sent to a nearby hospital for his injuries, and after that he was taken to the jail where he was charged with a hate crime, aggravated battery, and resisting an officer. He ran over a black man's foot with his vehicle, but he's the one who looks like he got hit by a car. I call that karma. And of course, you won't be surprised to learn that this isn't this racist thug's first brush with the law. He's been arrested at least once before in 2021 for theft, so he's a prior offender. But this is the dirty South we're talking about, where genetic immunity from law is on steroids, so don't expect much to happen to this creep. Though to be honest, looking at how he got the fit-foot-fop put on him, I'd say he's been through enough. But next time he decides to go mouthing off to a black man, I'll bet he keeps his windows rolled up. You want to know why these race soldiers do these cowardly ambushes so much like the one against Mr. Coleman? It's because they know full well exactly what would happen to them if they didn't pull some out-of-the-blue attack. This is why they do these sneak ambushes, and it's why, as we saw with Mr. Coleman, they'll normally make sure they got some friends who jump in to back them up. Because they need it. But the incident in Monroe, Louisiana illustrates that when black people have situational awareness and they are fully cognizant of their surroundings and that they're on guard against the enemy, then a would-be hate crime winds up becoming a righteous beatdown. But this reminds us all that a race attack can happen at any time, and that being the case, every black person should be ready and able to protect themselves. Even if you don't necessarily have the ability to knock some racist rube out cold, there's other ways you can be equipped to protect yourself, and you have a right to be safe and secure wherever you are, be it at home, in the parking lot of a store, or at the local VFW. And if someone decides they're going to violate your right to personal safety, then you need to be ready to exercise some personal protection too. And that's this week's Friday Crime Report. Keep your eyes open and stay on alert, because there's a lot worse criminals out there than the ones the white corporate media chooses to show you. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Jacques Hargett, Morris Bodden, Frederica Moore, Nora Brown, and Sakina Collins. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.